first association with Memphis is probably more academic than experiential. I don't think I encountered physical Memphis pieces until within the past 6 or 7 years. I probably first encountered Memphis through studying art and design in college. So I would say that it was probably in the context of studying design history or architectural history. The Memphis project was initiated officially initiated in December 1980. There were several meetings at Torres Office's apartment in Milan, where he came together with Barbara Dici and Kelly DeLucchi and Marco Zanini, Napo de Pasquier and George Soden, and a number of other largely Italian designers. There were 3 meetings at the end of 1980 and early 1981 in which they discussed their idea that they would attempt to introduce a line of commercially available products that would challenge the prevailing preference for functionalist design. I guess you could say that from the Bauhaus through that period, design that was considered good design largely followed principles of formal reduction and ergonomic simplicity. Instead of following that path, they decided that design also included a more communicative potential, and that potential to communicate emotion through design. The Memphis project itself, by the mid 1980s, in some ways, it had already begun to run its course. The Torres Office had begun to sort of pull back from the movement around 1985-86, because he felt that in some ways the project had achieved what it set out to do. Memphis had been wildly successful. It was shown in galleries around the world, written about in the press. It had been sort of replicated, or the sort of visual tropes of the Memphis style had been integrated into numerous forms of design in everyday dinnerware, cookware, rugs, other furnishings. It was appearing in films like Ruthless People with Danny DeVito. It kind of had reached a stage where it was more about a popular style than about what they'd initially set out to demonstrate, that there was like an alternative to this more functionalist approach to design. So Soltis determined that he had really no desire to continue producing work under the Memphis name, especially since they have this sort of annual rate. They would present every season in Milan. So he felt that they'd done what they needed to do, and they didn't really want to participate anymore. And the rest of the collective sort of quickly agreed with him. So 1987 became the final year in which they produced work as Memphis. And they determined that would be the end of the project, at least from the perspective of the designers. However, Memphis has always kind of existed in a way in 2 realms. There's sort of the movement of Memphis, which is the more ideological or philosophical approach to design that the designers brought to the project. And then there's the company Memphis SRL, which was formed in 1981, a few months after the initial meetings in Milan. And the occupation of the company was to manufacture and fund and market and distribute the work of the Memphis project. So even though the designers had determined that they were no longer going to continue making work as Memphis, the Memphis company was still going to exist because they had this entire catalog of products. So that put the company and the company's founder, Ernesto Gismondi, in kind of a difficult situation because he no longer had a steady flow of products to introduce to the market. So rather than simply trying to contract new designers to replace or replicate the work of the original Memphis collective, Gismondi decided to take a break, to kind of shut down new production for a couple of years and to consider how Memphis could continue as something new. A couple of years later, in 1989, he hired Carlotta de Bevilacqua as art director and a gallerist from Turin, Persona, to organize a new collection under the heading of Meta Memphis. So rather than working with people known for product design, they decided that in order to really mark the change between the original Memphis project and the Meta Memphis project, they were only going to work with figures who were pretty well known within the world of contemporary art. So they worked with Joseph Kosuth and Lawrence Wiener and Franz West and Michelangelo Pistoletto, Sandra Chia, and a number of other contemporary designer artists to produce a collection of limited edition pieces for Memphis. It's hard to know whether the Meta Memphis collection was well received when it was first presented because there's very little documentation or critical response that I've been able to track down regarding the collection. There are a number of catalogs that were produced for the openings. There was the original opening in 1989 in Venice, and then the second collection was released in 1991. So there was a catalog for that, and then there was also an exhibition in Germany in 1991, I believe, and a third catalog for that. But there's not a lot of sort of critical dialogue available that I've been able to find that references the Meta Memphis project. So in some ways, it feels as if the collection was sort of critically ignored at the time. The one reference that I was able to find to the collection was printed in the New York Times in 1989, and they were conducting an interview with Marco Zanini, who was one of the original Memphis designers, and they asked him if he'd seen the collection and what he thought about it, and his response was that he had heard that it was exhibited in a beautiful palace in Venice, but that he and no one he knew had gone to see it. So in a way, he was sort of just dismissing the relevance of the collection at that point. And I think that in some ways that was the challenge of Meta Memphis. They were producing this new collection and in some ways connecting it to a movement that at that point had sort of either run its course or fallen out of fashion with the larger design community. It seems to me that the Meta Memphis collection is relevant today, well, for a number of reasons. For me, it's personally relevant because I'm interested in the idea of transformation of a project, to see how a project can go from existing in one format to sort of a new identity in a new visual language and the way an entirely new mandate, to see if that transition can actually be made and be made successfully. But I also think that it's relevant in the sense that the revival of Memphis and all things 80s has kind of been underway for at least 4 or 5 years now. In the world of contemporary design, if you look online or go to the mall and furniture fair these days, there are numerous examples examples of this sort of neo-expressionistic, this styling. And I feel like that's kind of become quite popular, but it kind of leads to the question of, well, what sort of style or what motivation comes after that? What in a way can come next? And I think that same question is what the artists who were charged with designing the Memphis collection were asking themselves. Memphis had produced a very strong statement about their position toward design in the 1980s, and so when the Memphis collection was introduced in the end of the 80s, early 90s, the question of what comes next seems to have been very much on the minds of those who were working on it. And to me, that seems to be a question that's relevant to ask again today. I think if you were to compare the original Memphis pieces with the Memphis pieces, the visual contrast between both is pretty apparent. The Memphis pieces largely employ bold patterns, bold colors, and very sort of irregular geometric forms. Whereas the Memphis pieces seem to be driven a lot more by their conceptual underpinnings, and maybe more an attention to natural materials in a way. You have a lot more very complex materials, metals and woods and terracotta and plexiglass, but less of a use of pattern, less of a use of color. It's more raw stone, raw metals, or just the natural tonality of the material. So on first appearance, I think the Memphis pieces appear far more subdued than the Memphis pieces. But I do think that there's still a link between them, and I think that to me, the interesting link is that the Memphis project was largely concerned with this idea that objects can be used as tools of communication rather than simply as a functional background for everyday life. And I think that idea of the work or the piece as a tool that communicates ideas is something that's deeply embedded in that Memphis project as well. When you're working on a new piece, I guess there's always risks involved, in the sense that you never know what sort of reaction a work could engender, or what kind of deafening silence it might kind of create. I guess whenever people make something, there's generally a desire to communicate a mood or a taste or a sensibility toward the world. Oftentimes, I think that work that is presented today can be overlooked, but that doesn't mean that 20 years down the line, someone won't sort of stumble upon it and rediscover it and be able to see how the effects of that work can be used to interplay into a product that's contemporary then. I think that the most important part is really the publishing, or the putting the work out there, putting it into a context in which it can be archived in some way, so that there's always the possibility of it producing effects at some point in the future. I think that there are many artists, many designers whose work isn't widely known, isn't widely known in their lifetime, and never maybe becomes widely known, and yet the work can still be, I think, incredibly successful in the sense that it can have meaning and produce effects for those people who do encounter it and do, in some way, form a bond of communication. One feature that most people producing things would desire the least is for people to just like turn their heads and walk away. You know, I guess it's like you want there to be some form of reaction or response to an encounter.